Agnew. I'm the Director of Energy Services here at CES, and I'll be your host or MC today. This is, again, second part of our stay-at-home seminar series, and just handle a few of the administrative items right off the bat here. If you could, please do keep muted for the entire program today. We're doing cameras off. As much as we'd like to see your faces, we just ask that you keep your cameras off, please. For questions, we would love to get your questions, so please do use the chat feature. Depending on how things wrap up, we may open some dialogue up at the end of the presentation today. But in the meantime, if you have any questions along the way, use the chat feature. Should be at the top right hand corner of your screen. Any technical difficulties, or if you'd like to direct those questions to just one person rather than the group, please use Casey Gallipo. She'll be assembling those so that we can take care of those as we get them, if not by the end of the presentation today. Just another housekeeping note. We will send these presentation slides to everyone via email after the presentation today, so no need to ask. We will get these all out to you for reference. So without anything further, it looks like we've added a few more folks walking in through the door here, so we're up to 40. Nice to see you, Amy and others who have joined. Brian, thanks for joining us today. This is Charlie Agnew again with Competitive Energy Services. Just walk through the agenda for today. Andy's going to give a welcoming note. Following that, a team of us will provide updates on the energy markets. We'll go into a little bit of detail about state renewable programs, highlight some of the things to take away from today, and then transition to question and answers. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Andy.
Thanks, Charlie. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining our seminar this afternoon. It's always good to have you. My name's Andy Price, President of Competitive Energy Services. We are celebrating, or did celebrate, our 20th year in business last year. Since I joined Competitive Energy 19 years ago in 2001, one of the highlights for me has always been the Energy Seminar Series we typically host in the spring. Of course, it was always a highlight because we got to talk to you directly, as Charlie has mentioned already. And this year is going to be a little bit different and a bit difficult with the online format, but we're going to make do as best we can, and certainly appreciate you joining us today. I did want to highlight for you that Competitive Energy Services is at 100% capacity. All staff are working remotely, and we're very focused on making sure that you're able to navigate pretty volatile energy markets throughout this spring, as well as the obvious usage uncertainty in your own facilities and operational uncertainties. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us or anybody at Competitive Energy. We're here to help, and we'd like to be helpful. With that, and with apologies for anybody who was on the seminar last week or who already is pretty familiar with Competitive Energy, I'll just do a very brief introduction about us. We are a full-service energy advisory firm. We do have very empty offices in Portland, Maine and Topsfield, Massachusetts, and staff in some very crowded home offices in every New England state. Our clients are across the United States and Canada. Those clients are, like yourselves, all end users. We do that very much intentionally so that you have every certainty that we're always 100% supplier neutral and product neutral. We offer procurement services for just about every energy commodity that you can imagine. We also offer discrete consulting services. These days, our consulting practice is heavily focused on renewable energy, energy master planning, climate action planning, greenhouse gas tracking, and battery storage solutions. those larger clients that we have who have both procurement and discrete consulting needs, we're often packaging the right set of those services together along with budgeting and variance tracking, and we call that our full service category. Our procurement work is definitely better because of the consulting side of our business, and the reverse is also very true. Our consulting practice definitely benefits from our 20 years of expertise and activity in the procurement realm. So we think this is something that really sets competitive energy apart. With that, and before we sort of jump into the meat of the presentation here, we did want to just take a brief moment and remember a good friend and colleague of ours, Pete Bartlett. Pete was a vice president with Competitive Energy for well more than a decade, and we lost Pete in December of this past year. We know many of you knew Pete well and worked for many years with Pete, and so we thought it was appropriate just to recognize his loss and impact on all of us here today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Charlie.
Thanks, Andy. And obviously, for those that may have actually met me through Pete, I worked with Pete since the beginning of my time here at CES, and he was an important part of our team and the thought, effort, and attention to detail that goes into our work here at CES. And he was always a pillar in the presentations on seminar day, and someone who I'll never forget. I think most of you who knew him will feel the same way. And again, his dedication to clients and client interests is really what this seminar is all about, and providing good and timely information was one of the things that Pete held closest. So with that, we'll get into some of the market updates, and I'll turn that over to Chris Brook and Elliot Boyd to talk through oil and propane.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie, and thank you everyone for joining today. The major story in oil is that COVID-19 demand destruction is causing peak storage and lower prices. This first slide we're going to look at is U.S. crude oil stocks and Nymex prompt month futures. That blue shaded area in the middle represents the 5-year range of oil in storage. The dark blue line is the current year storage levels, which, as you can see, sharply increased during March and April as that COVID-19 demand construction unfolded. The red line is the WTI prompt month Nymex oil futures contract. We all know that crude oil traded at negative prices recently, which was a clear warning just how scarce storage space for oil is getting. A lot of questions on, how do you get to negative oil prices? Well, people left holding the May contract when it settled. They would have had to taken delivery of that oil at Cushing, Oklahoma, but there was nowhere for them to store it. So they had to get rid of that obligation, actually paying off-takers to accept the oil. The OPEC Plus Alliance joined the output cuts May 1st, agreeing to reduce their output by more than 20%, or approximately 10 million barrels per day. And currently, crude is trading about $23 a barrel. This slide, we're going to look at crude production and rig count. The gold line is the U.S. oil rig count, which is the best indicator of how the U.S. industry is reacting to the storage crisis. Before COVID-19 hit, oil companies ran about 650 rigs in the U.S. And by Friday last week, 50% of them had stopped working. So there's only 325 operational right now. The blue line represents U.S. crude production in barrels per day. This had been trending higher, up to a peak of 13 million barrels per day pre-COVID-19. And this was done even as the number of producing oil rigs was steadily trending down, which was mainly due to higher production efficiencies. ULSD and gasoline prices are near 20-year lows as demand falls and refiners face storage issues. And it's expected that global refiners refineries could halt as much as 25% of total capacity in May. In addition, as production rigs are going offline, futures prices for associated liquids such as propane and natural gas are increasing as they rely in part on supply sourced from oil production. The longer-term outlook is a little steadier for now. Those outer months are in what we call a classic contango market, which is to say that futures prices are higher than spot prices. So the market is expecting prices to rise over time as demand returns. The key takeaway here is it's a good time to consider looking at future open positions if you haven't already done so. Thank you, and now I'm going to turn it over to Elliot Boyd to discuss current propane fundamentals.
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks again for joining us, and I'll dive right into the propane market here. First, we're going to take a look at some national indicators. So propane prices are set in Mont Belvieu, Texas, where propane is currently trading around 34 cents. This graph right here shows a 12-month historical look, and we can see that prices have rebounded slightly since March. However, we are in the midst of a market low, with current prices down about 50% compared to the same time last year. So we have seen a surplus of propane in storage on the national level, and this is largely due to a drop in global propane demand. But propane production has remained at consistent levels through the winter and into the spring. The real story here is in U.S. exports, which have decreased 30% in the past months, largely as a result of COVID-19 and its impacts to propane importers in Asia, Europe, and South America. We'll move to the next slide here and touch on a few notes specific to the New England region. So first off, general price volatility has created market conditions which make it particularly difficult for suppliers to hedge longer-term contracts. So the takeaway here is that CES has seen better savings opportunities offered for those short-term supply agreements. Another note here specific to New England is that Plains Marketing, who's a Canadian wholesaler of propane to many retailers here in the region, has exited the New England propane market. So they've sold off all of their terminals and storage assets to a company called Crestwood LP. So this is a change in ownership that could potentially impact the operation of some propane terminals here in Maine. The transition has been smooth thus far, and we haven't seen any disruptions to the region's supply chain to date, but we'll continue to monitor this transition for potential impacts moving forward. Lastly here, we're going to look out onto the horizon and what's in store for U.S. propane. The story here is that U.S. propane is going to be shaped by the U.S. oil and natural gas industries moving forward. Now, as Chris mentioned, and I'm sure you've all heard in the news, the outlook for U.S. oil producers is uncertain as rigs continue to fall offline and U.S. oil production declines on the whole. As it stands, the U.S. is currently the #1 exporter of propane in the world. However, disruptions to the oil and natural gas industries may limit national propane production and could result in strained supply chains if producers get caught between meeting domestic and overseas demand. For these reasons, we can expect impacts to production, storage, and exports of propane as we all move forward into uncharted territory here in the energy marketplace. Our recommendation to propane users is to establish a strategy for procurement and to continue monitoring the market as we move forward. With all that said, I'll hand off the microphone to Charlie Agnew, and he'll be digging into the state of natural gas and electricity here.
Thanks, Elliot and Chris. I think that mask picture you had would have been more appropriate for my natural gas joke, but thanks for relieving the pressure there. I'll jump into natural gas and electricity markets here. As Elliot and Chris alluded to, the natural gas market right now is very much tied to what's happening in oil, and a good indicator is when we look at the Permian Basin of West Texas, where these oil rigs are falling offline. Those production facilities are also bringing up liquids like propane and natural gas, and as we've seen those rigs come out of production, we've seen a drop in production of natural gas from the region of about 2% since early March. And With Briggs falling offline, we expect some of that momentum to really carry forward all through 2020, and that production number for natural gas to continue to drop. So what we've seen in response to that expectation is that these natural gas future markets going into next winter and the years beyond that have started to recover. We've seen a little bit of price momentum there. So that's something we want to keep an eye on as we go through calendar 2020. One other major component of each New England gas consumer's cost to purchase this fuel are the interstate transportation costs, or basis component of gas supply. Couple updates to our New England pipeline infrastructure to point out, first being the final stage of the Atlantic Bridge project, which will be an upgrade to a compressor station in Weymouth, Massachusetts, which will allow flow from south to north for the first time of gas expected after November 1st. Portland Express and Westbrook Express are two expansion projects we're watching on the Portland Natural Gas Transmission System, or PNGTS. These are incremental expansions along that existing pipeline that will deliver more gas across Western Canada from the Dawn Hub down through Berlin, New Hampshire, Rumford, and into Westbrook. Those projects along PNGTS are on track and expected to be completed by the end of 2020. One other piece of the puzzle here is the liquefied natural gas that is injected into our regional pipeline system from St. John, New Brunswick, a facility called Canaport owned by Repsol. And with a decline in global liquefied natural gas, or LNG, prices over the past couple of years, we've seen the owner of that facility injecting gas not only on the most expensive peaking days of the winter and year, but we've seen a bit more baseload gas all throughout the winter being injected into the pipeline, and that overall has helped to stabilize forward-looking basis prices. It has not alleviated the spot price volatility, simply because we still lack the appropriate or adequate infrastructure to meet all heating demands and certainly electricity demands on the coldest of winter days. So these projects have certainly helped flatten basis, but have not alleviated our New England pipeline infrastructure issues. So just to summarize a few takeaways here, basis prices have flattened. We are looking at commodity prices that are pushing against some decade lows. And we think looking at keeping a close eye on these storage figures as we move through calendar 2020 will be good for those customers that are shopping for future gas contracts. But those that are, we should be pricing your renewal terms if you have not looked at that already, monitoring the market here and implementing a strategy that'll help take advantage of some of these low gas prices right now. One of the other takeaways from gas is that natural gas continues to be the primary power plant fuel here in New England. You can see in 2019, roughly half of the generation mix. And so as the price of gas moves, so does electricity, which will be our next commodity topic here. And what we're attempting to show on the screen here is we're in between power years 2019, 2020, and 2020-21 currently. But overall, the total cost of electricity supply, this is exclusive of your utility charges, we're seeing those prices trend down and flattening out upon the horizon you see here. But each of these components, cost components, tells a different story. So we're going to get into that a little bit more. The first and largest component that we've talked about already is the energy component, tied directly again to the natural gas market. And where we are today, we're seeing some step down relative to the past few years. But over the next 3 or 4 years, we're seeing some slight price escalation as you go from winter to winter and from year to year. So overall message here is that these commodity prices are fairly flat and relatively low to the past few years. One of the other major cost components of electricity supply are the forward capacity market charges, or capacity as we call them sometimes, which really is a program implemented by ISO New England and ties back to each customer's contribution to the peak load hour on our New England electric grid, typically a hot summer afternoon. And that contribution has an impact on your capacity and supply costs. Well, the good news for consumers here is that the cost of capacity, the cost for running your facility during that peak hour of the year, will be going down in the next 4 power years. ISO New England recently held the auction for FCA 14 and settled on a price of $2 per kW month for the power year 2023-2024, which was the lowest in history. So overall, good news for customers in that these cost components are trending down. But for those who are managing their load and capacity tags over this time horizon, it's relevant to note that the impact to your supply costs will be less and less throughout this time horizon. One of the lesser additional components of electricity supply costs starting in June of 2022 will be another ISO New England program called Fuel Security, which is very much similar to past years' winter reliability programs aimed at addressing some generation and gas shortfalls during the winter months. And ultimately, this will be paid to ensure reliability through the winter months and predominantly support a power plant, Mystic Station down in Boston, to keep that facility operating through 2024 and 2025. So for customers who are shopping new electricity supply terms, you can expect to see fuel security noted within those contracts as either a fixed component or a pass-through charge. And for those that have already executed contracts through these outer years shown, you should be aware that these cost components could start showing up on your bill in the second half of 2022. Lastly, we'll talk here in a bit more detail as we move through the presentation on Maine's Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS. And this is one of the growing supply cost components over the next few years that is really a result of some state policy to become more aggressive about a shift towards renewable energy, specifically in the electricity sector, And I'm going to turn this over to Matt Gamache now, who is going to tell you a bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. Sounds like the takeaway here for supply costs is that they are trending down and then flattening out over time. Hopefully that's not the only curve that we see trend down and flatten out here. But one of the reasons we see that flattening of costs and not a decline related to those declining forward capacity market charges is the growing impact of the renewable portfolio standard that Charlie just mentioned. So to go into a little detail on that, the renewable portfolio standard is a state level policy that has been adopted by the majority of states in the country. And it requires a certain percentage of any electricity served in that state to be supplied through renewable sources that qualify under different categories, classifications, and carve-outs for compliance. And the way that an electricity supplier demonstrates compliance with this standard is by procuring and purchasing and retiring the required percentage of renewable energy credits, or RECs, associated with the standard. What we're showing here is the Class 1 or new renewable classifications across New England. And you can really see how Maine's most recent renewable portfolio standard policy puts it at the most aggressive goal in the region, setting a goal of 50% new renewables in its Class 1 and Class 1A requirements by 2030. And that was done through Maine's LD 1494, which came about last June and took effect beginning this year. And you can see that ramp up. That ramp up is going to cause increasing costs for consumers. And those costs are expected to top out or reach over $1.50 or well over $15 a megawatt hour by 2030. You can see the majority of those costs are coming in the form of that Class 1 and Class 1A requirement shown in shades of green here, which represents new renewables. Typically, you could think of those as wind and solar that's either been recently built or will be coming online sometime in the future. And you can see in the orange line, beyond the 50% new renewable requirement, we've got other requirements that get us up to 80% of electricity served in the state will be covered through one of these standards by 2030. So it's a pretty aggressive goal. It's going to have a cost associated with it. But those costs aren't just a net cost for consumers. They create an incentive for renewable generators, which has the effect of not only incentivizing new renewables online and decreasing carbon on the grid, but also those renewable generators typically have no marginal cost associated with their generation, and therefore they bring down wholesale pricing. And so there's some degree of a counterbalancing impact there. But speaking of those new renewables, at least a good portion of them will come in the form of distributed generation as the result of another new piece of legislation that Maine passed called LD 1711. I know many of you in this call are familiar with this legislation or have talked about it with us or are probably hearing about it from others. Many are looking to develop projects, specifically solar developers, under this legislation. And what it did is it expanded Maine's net metering or net energy billing program, as well as established a new standard buyer program. And without going into all the nitty-gritty details on those, because many of you may already know them, essentially it allows much larger projects than historically could qualify to export electricity back to the utility grid and in exchange receive a utility bill credit. And it allowed a new form of crediting, a monetary credit that can show up on your bill. And those credits can be allocated to any number of accounts in Central Maine Power or one of the two Emera service territories. So we're seeing a lot of interest in this program. This chart was derived from an ISO New England forecast, which shows some of the aggressive ramp up that at least ISO is expecting beginning in the early 2020s, where you can see Maine's distributed solar capacity doubling in just a few years' time. I think many in the industry might say this is probably conservative, given the amount of interest we've seen. Obviously, there are some unknown impacts of how COVID-19 will impact development timelines, but I think undoubtedly we're going to see a lot of development under these programs, and it's something that it's worth looking at for many end users.
Thanks, Matt. And it sounds like you mentioned credits. Now, credits sound good, but there are a couple different types here, right? We have renewable energy credits that, as a result of this new RPS, are going to cost these customers and ratepayers more money. But for those that own or control those renewable energy credits, through action or development of qualified projects, it sounds like there's opportunity there to take advantage of and maybe help to offset or avoid some of those new RPS, renewable portfolio standard costs.
Yeah, no, and it's an important distinction there, and not to mix them up. We've got renewable energy credits equal to a megawatt hour of qualified renewable generation. And then separate from that, we've got utility bill credits that these DG or distributed generation facilities can qualify to generate, and those show up on a utility bill based on a portion of the utility's tariff. And both of those credits are important revenue streams for incentivizing new renewable projects. And if you are, as you highlight, the controlling entity and you have those credits, both are expected to have some good value and increasing value going forward on your utility bill or in the form of a REC sale.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. I think I'm also interested in knowing, what else is on the horizon? What else is being contemplated at the state level? Can you fill us in a little bit about that?
Glad you asked. Beyond these policies that have the ones I've just highlighted, really exclusively focused on the electricity sector, you may have been read about or have been reading about the Maine Climate Council. This was also established under that same series of energy bills passed last year. They began meeting in September of 2019, and the Climate Council is tasked with coming up with an even more comprehensive strategy to start to make our way towards some very aggressive greenhouse gas goals for the state. Those goals are shown in this chart provided by the Maine DEP. We've got a 2030 goal of a 45% reduction in emissions below 1990 levels, and a 2050 goal of an 80% reduction. What's important to remember is that those greenhouse gas emissions come from not just the electricity sector, but also, and for a large part, the heating and transportation sectors. And so I think, this Climate Council is due to release a 4-year state climate action plan by the end of the year. That will be telling on where the state sort of sees at least the near-term opportunities to start chipping away at these greenhouse gas emissions. I would expect that some of those policies and some of those recommendations are going to be focused on the heating and transportation sectors, things like heat pumps and technologies that can, greater transition some of those combustion emissions towards electrification. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Charlie, to close out the presentation.
Thanks, Matt. Great presentation. Thank you. And just wanted to have a couple key takeaways from today to leave folks with. First, with respect to these energy markets and how each of the oil, propane, and natural gas markets are in contango. And what that means for buyers here is that we are seeing near-term opportunities, discounted costs for each of these commodities in the near term. And with the longer terms being slightly more expensive than near term, a look to the balance of 2020 to see if some of those prices settle out. And one thing to note with a lot of the liquid fuel suppliers we deal with, due to the volatility in these commodity markets, there's been, some are having troubles and issues hedging commodity prices out into the future. So there are some higher differentials if you are looking at hedging fuel oil or propane contracts out into the future. And we think as some of this volatility settles out that some of that will be resolved. With respect to the state of Maine and some of the programs and opportunities that Matt was talking about, it seems crucial to understand each of these renewable programs, some that are going to drive more costs on the supply and even delivery side of the bills, and also open up opportunities for those that can or seek to participate. So good to have an understanding of those and what opportunities may exist. And then on the incentive front and what's coming down the pipeline with the Climate Council, it seems natural for those to start thinking about how to eliminate or taking advantage of programs that might help to eliminate some of these fossil fuel combustion systems, either heating or transportation, knowing that incentives for heat pumps and electric vehicles and charging may continue from Efficiency Maine into the future. For overall energy management, we're obviously all in a bit of uncharted territory and really some challenging times given the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's really upended these energy markets and made the development of a strategy more difficult. And then to layer in all of these rapid policy changes that are leading to a growth of renewable development all at the same time, it does take some attention, and I think our message here from CES is that we're here and informed and able to support those with development of a strategy for your own unique business. But we do take that seriously and want to keep you all informed. So on that note, and before we wrap here and transition to questions, I just wanted to let everyone know about the few upcoming seminars we have starting next week with Massachusetts and some of the other New England state seminars. And the final sustainability focused seminar will be on June 4th. So we hope you will join us. Please let us know if you need help registering. And at this point, we're going to turn it over to a little Q&A. But for those that need to split, we thank you all for your time today and attention and support, and we look forward to continuing to work with you going forward. A few of the questions that came in through your registrations, one being the status of the Clean Energy Connect project. Andy, wondered if you'd be willing to start us off with an update as we know it to Clean Energy Connect.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Charlie. And just before I start on the Clean Energy Connect, we'll highlight for folks, there's a little chat feature that you can see in the upper right-hand corner. Them that way. So click on the little question bubble and enter your questions, and we'd be happy to field those as they come in. So a number of people did make reference in their questions when they registered to the Clean Energy Connect. I think a lot of the references were related to potential cost impacts should that line be commissioned. as well as to the status. So just to frame the discussion for everybody, probably familiar with it given how much it's been in the news, but the Maine Clean Energy Connect is a roughly 145-mile high voltage direct current transmission line running from the Quebec border to Lewiston, Maine, where it would interconnect with the rest of the ISO New England high voltage transmission grid. It's about $1 billion construction project. And as you may have seen, Central Maine Power, who is sponsoring the Maine portion of the line, has already started issuing contracts for construction to start taking place this summer. There is some controversy surrounding that, and it may well end up making its way onto the ballot this November under a citizens referendum to try to force a reversal of a Maine PUC permit that was awarded. There are a number of permits the line still needs from the Army Corps of Engineers and as well as a presidential permit, given that this is a power line that crosses the border. The line is intended to bring hydropower from Quebec through Maine and ultimately deliver the power and renewable energy attributes to consumers in Massachusetts. The origin of the line dates back quite a few years to the Green Communities Act, which was a piece of legislation passed in Massachusetts that Massachusetts passed to try to take action on climate change. And one of the things authorized by that act was the procurement of some hydropower from Canada. The first line that was investigated was the Northern Pass line through New Hampshire. Ultimately, that line was not able to get the local permits to get constructed and was terminated. The second project in the ranking, or that submitted a bid to Massachusetts, was the Maine Clean Energy Connect. And so if the line is successful and gets built, that $1 billion price tag would be paid for by ratepayers in Massachusetts. It would not be something that would be recovered in Maine by Central Maine Power ratepayers. So if the line were to go forward, we would not expect to see any impact on your Central Maine Power delivery rates. We would expect to see a bit of a decrease, in fact, to regional wholesale power rates. That's because whenever you introduce a large source of generation into the region, it has a suppressing effect on wholesale power prices. It's uncertain exactly what that impact might be over time. It depends on a bunch of factors, but we might see something between $1 and a few dollars per megawatt hour reduction in wholesale power prices. So something north of $10 million per year for Maine consumers, but probably less than $40 million per year, something in that ballpark. So those are the potential sort of cost impacts. Still some uncertainty as to when exactly the line will be built, if it will be built, and you may even have a chance to submit a vote on it this November. One other thing I'll mention there, it was brought up earlier in the presentation, the ISO New England Fuel Security Initiative. This line and other lines like it were a component of what ISO New England is modeling when they think about fuel security and potential natural gas pipeline shortages on the peak winter day. They're looking at lines like this as a component of potential fuel shortages, shortages of natural gas being able to be delivered to power plants on those peak hours when all of that gas is needed for heating households. And so this line could play a role there as well on the fuel security front.
Great, thanks, Andy. Had another question up on the board here about the Efficiency Maine funding and grant availability. I think we've covered this a little bit, but maybe an item to add to the conversation here is or was a rate case, an approved rate case that CMP received that was effective March 1st. One we hadn't, that took a while to move through, but a lot of the majority of that increase did or will flow through to the Efficiency Maine Trust. So relevant to note that those programs do seem well funded. We've talked about the state's policy interests in advancing electrification, specifically heat pump rebates. We've also seen some EV charging and EV electric vehicle rebates from Efficiency Maine. So I think those are the items to highlight for the time being. And another question here on how to save money for the company. I think we highlighted that in the key takeaways here, which were, look at kind of near-term buying opportunities and perhaps the balance of the year here to see future years and market prices settle out as some of the volatility eases with response to COVID-19. Matt, I had a question come in. I'll pass to you. This was going back to your RPS Renewable Portfolio Standard slide where you showed the different cost components per megawatt hour of various classes, and there was a question about the differential between Class 1 and Class 1A. Could you provide some color to that, and I'll flip back to that slide while we're...
Sure, yeah. That's a good distinction. The differential there is not so much a projection in differing REC values underlying those requirements, but in fact, we project those REC values will be very similar. Many of the same resources that qualify as Class 1 will qualify as Class 1A and vice versa. They've got mostly similar qualification standards, but the Class 1A portion is what is expected to and set to grow, and that's why that Class 1A lighter shade of green in this chart is the component that's growing over time out till 2030. Hopefully that adds some clarification.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you, Matt.
Yeah, no problem.
Another question here regarding COVID-19, and this comes from John Hartz on the other side of the microphone today. But we had, just question about the outlook for peak day with all that's happening with COVID-19. Obviously, maybe most impactful is would be the commercial real estate market. So many people moved out of the commercial real estate space and into their homes. We've talked a lot about how the demand from that market, in particular, particularly southern New England, has driven the peak day demands throughout time here. So question is about how that may shift if folks are working from home, or what the other impacts of that peak may be, or either a lesser peak or a greater peak than years past. Matt, do you want to take that?
I'm happy to jump in, and also if anyone else wants to add, feel free. But this year's peak day is going to be more difficult to predict, certainly, due to those points Charlie just raised. I think it was already getting more and more difficult to predict with the amount of behind-the-meter generation we're seeing on the New England grid, shifting that peak hour later into the afternoon or potentially earlier in the day on some kind of rare occasions. And I think, this summer, we're expecting that, those taking action to curtail during peak hours may be looking at longer windows in which they're asked to curtail, given some of that uncertainty. So far, we've been looking at ISO's generation or, demand curves to see, what sort of impact this work from home lifestyle has had on the region's demand for electricity. We've seen, somewhere in the 3 to 5% range, but of course, April's not always a great indicator given demand in April is so weather dependent. As we know in New England, Aprils can look very different from year to year. So some of that might become more clear as we move into some hot weather and start to get a feel for what the demand curve looks like, given that we don't have maybe some of the demands from commercial real estate, commercial offices, restaurants and bars using the same electricity loads that they normally would. But it's certainly going to be a more difficult summer.
Yeah, difficult to predict, and there was mention of the reserve margin here, and this is something we're seeing in this current power year, where when loads are reduced, and even though these capacity rates may decline, if the overall load continues to trend downward, that's the total New England measured demand during this peak hour, some of the decline in the capacity rate could be offset by a higher reserve. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, and something we're certainly working on and attempting to model. I think we have just maybe one or two short months here of history to look at, and expect some more to come out of the coming months as in order to model the summer peak. So, but a great question, and one we're getting a lot right now. We've got everyone still on board here, so just want to thank everyone again for joining. We've got we'll stay on, or I can stay on as long as anyone would like. Any questions? Again, please enter them in the chat screen. I think we're nearing a point. If you'd have something to voice, you can feel free to do that as well. But again, thanks everyone for joining. We appreciate your support, and we'll certainly be following up with the presentation for reference today, and look forward to seeing you at future seminars that we'll be hosting throughout the spring here. So thank you very much. Have a great day.